Okay, I'm going to get started. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to my presentation this morning. That's a nice-sized crowd. I wasn't expecting such a big group on a Friday morning. My name's Mark James, and I'm an associate professor of applied linguistics at Arizona State University. Today, I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes about one of the recent published studies that I've carried out on this topic, learning transfer in EAP writing education. And we'll have some time then for questions. I don't have a handout, but I'm going to post my PowerPoint slides and a recording of my presentation on my website. So feel free to visit and download that if you like. Here's the address, and I'll put this up again at the end of the presentation. So this study is part of a line of research that I've been doing on learning transfer. And the context of most of this research has been English for academic purposes, or EAP, writing instruction. And I'll say at the beginning that this study and several of the other studies that I've been doing recently have been conducted in university contexts, post-secondary contexts. But this issue of transfer I see as being relevant across levels of education and widely applicable across academic contexts. My own background is in K through 12 education, EFL education, university EAP education, a range of contexts. And I see these issues as being widely applicable. But this study will focus on a specific university context. So this study looks at one particular kind of EAP writing instruction, that which is discipline general. Now, discipline specificity is a key dimension along which EAP instruction varies, with discipline-specific EAP instruction targeting learning outcomes associated with a particular discipline. This includes outcomes like understanding the discourse and sentence-level characteristics of a lab report in chemistry, or of a legal brief in law. On the other hand, discipline general EAP, or what I'm going to call EGAP, targets learning outcomes believed to be applicable across disciplines. And this includes outcomes like using a writing process and using resources. I focused this study on EGAP writing instruction because this model is common in North American universities, where the students in an EAP writing course often come from various disciplines. Now, looking at EGAP writing instruction from the perspective of learning transfer raises an important question. Learning transfer is the fundamental goal of any form of EAP writing instruction, because without transfer, what's been learned in a classroom to situations beyond that classroom, instruction has limited value. With EGAP writing instruction, there's an expectation that learning will transfer across a range of tasks in a variety of disciplines. But over a century's worth of research in experimental and educational psychology and human resources development suggests that learning transfer is elusive. Also, second language writing scholars and first language writing scholars have questioned whether discipline general writing instruction can really lead to such broad transfer. And while empirical research has shed some light on this issue, the results have been mixed and gaps are apparent. In particular, the extent to which learning transfers from EGAP writing instruction is unclear. So with that conceptual framework in mind, I developed a study to answer the following research questions. Does learning transfer from EGAP writing instruction to other academic courses? If so, what transfers and to where? And to answer these questions, I carried out a qualitative case study over an academic year with students enrolled in one section of a 2-semester freshman EGAP writing course. Of the 19 students enrolled in that section, 11 participated in the study. And this slide provides some basic background information about these students. I gathered data throughout the year in two main ways: through interviews with students and by collecting writing samples from students' work across their courses. I interviewed each student in the middle and at the end of the fall semester and most of the students again in the middle and at the end of the spring semester. Each interview involved a parallel set of questions which focused on whether learning in the EGAP course had any impact on writing done for graded tasks in other courses. For the writing samples, I asked students to provide copies of any writing they did for graded tasks in other courses. Since I was interested in how broadly transfer would occur, I asked for any kind of writing, from lab reports and essays to short answers on tests or quizzes, and so on. And data analysis involved two main steps. First, I examined the interview transcripts for students' reports of transfer. I broke the transcripts into units of analysis, each of which dealt with a particular task in a course other than the EGAP course. And then I coded each unit for the discipline they were talking about, the task type, and what, if any, kind of transfer had been reported. So to illustrate, here's one unit of analysis that dealt with a test in a math course. So the way that I coded it looked like this. For discipline, I used the university's own system of categorization for courses and programs. And this unit fell into the category natural sciences. You can see near the top there. For task type, I made some slight modifications to a system of categorization published by Horowitz in a 1986 article in the TESOL Quarterly. And with this modified system, this unit fell into the category explanation of calculation. And for the kind of transfer, I used categories from a model of academic language use developed by Chappell, Grabe, and Burns in a 1997 TOEFL monograph. And this unit fell into the category establishing coherence. And the second step in data analysis was to examine the students' writing samples. As with the interview transcripts, I coded writing samples for discipline and task type. Unlike the interview transcripts, though, I decided to identify in advance what kind of transfer I would look for. So I generated a list of learning outcomes that were targeted explicitly in the first section of the EGAP course textbook. And my reasoning was that these, first of all, these were expected to transfer. And second of all, these would have the most opportunity to transfer because they were at the beginning of the book and they would have the rest of the semester, the rest of the year to try to transfer these things. So through that process, I came up with the list that you can see here of 10 specific learning outcomes to look for in the writing samples that I gathered from the students. And I'll illustrate that a little further. To illustrate, here are the first two of those 10 learning outcomes. The first one is describing visually, and the second one is stating personal significance. In the second column here, we can see the operational definitions that I created. And these were meant to reflect as closely as possible the way the learning outcome was addressed in the EGAP course textbook. For example, the way that it was described and explained to the students, to the readers. For the first one, describing visually, the textbook explained that describing people, places, or objects involved naming observable features like parts and providing details like size, number, composition, and function. So that's the basis of the definition that I created here. And as you can see in the third column, examples of that learning outcome being applied in students' actual writing samples. The next row provides similar information for the second of the 10 learning outcomes. The second one was stating personal significance. And then I did the same thing with the other 8. And finally, after coding all the writing samples in this way, I needed to decide if and where transfer had occurred. So I looked at the relationship between a student's writing sample from the EGAP course and each of her or his writing samples from other courses. I assumed that transfer had occurred if a student had applied a given learning outcome in the writing sample from the EGAP course and had applied the same learning outcome in a writing sample from another course. And to check the reliability of this entire procedure, I asked another researcher with practical experience in this area, as well as research experience in this area, to code 20% of the data set that I had worked with. And the agreement between our coding decisions was over 90%, which seems satisfactory. So now we'll take a look at the findings as they relate to the two research questions. Did learning transfer from this EGAP writing course to other academic courses? And if so, what transferred and to where? First, let's look at the data from the interview transcripts. And in terms of what, if anything, transferred, we can see here that the students reported that various kinds of transfer had occurred. This is a list of 8 different categories of transfer that the students reported. And they're presented here in order of frequency, based on the number of students who reported the transfer to one or more tasks in their other courses. Because of time, I won't go over all of these in detail, but I'll show one example just to illustrate how the students reported this transfer. And this example will be from the most common category at the top of the list, organizing. So in this example, this student was asked by me about 2 assignments in a film studies course. And the student reported having tried on those assignments to use a general essay structure. More specifically, an introduction, main point, conclusion structure that the student had been learning to use in the EGAP course. So that's an example of the way they reported the transfer. As for where reported transfer occurred, this table shows the patterns that emerged across the students. The rows here are task types, like summaries of readings and reports of experiences. And the columns are the disciplines, like business and graphic design. The blank cells just mean that I didn't have any data for that task type in that discipline. So for example, looking down the column under business, on the left side of the table, there are 3 blank cells. That means that none of the business course tasks that I discussed in interviews with the students were those task types, which are reports on experiences, syntheses of sources, or research proposals. I didn't have any data on those. But the cells that have something written in them indicate that I did have data for that task type in that discipline. The pairs of numbers indicate how much transfer, if any, occurred. And where transfer occurred, the letters in parentheses indicate what kind of transfer that was. So looking again at the column under business, the first row has a 0 followed by a 1. The 1 means that in the entire set of interview data, there was only one task that fell into this category: a summary of readings in a business course. And the 0 before it means that the student who reported having done that task said that there was no transfer. So it's 0 reports of transfer for the one task in that category. 2 rows down, there's a 1 followed by a 1. And this means that in this category, which is the connection of theory and data in a business course, there was one task. And the student who did this task did report transfer. And the letters in parentheses indicate that that transfer fell into 2 categories: O for organizing and R for using resources. And one more row down, we can see that there were 2 tasks in the category of case study in a business course. And transfer was reported for one of those tasks. The letter P indicates that this transfer involved using a writing process. So stepping back from that table, there's a lot of detail here. But the main thing to note is that transfer was reported to at least some degree across all 6 disciplines and all 7 task types. As for the writing sample data, that was the interview data. Now the writing sample data, and the question of what, if anything, transferred, this table shows the relevant findings. In the first column, you can see the student 1 through 11. But note that students 2 and 7 were excluded here because they didn't submit any writing samples from courses other than the EGAP course for me to analyze. In column 2, you can see the total number of writing samples from courses other than the EGAP course that I analyzed for each student. And then there are 10 columns, one for each of the learning outcomes that was targeted explicitly in the EGAP course textbook and that I chose to search for in the writing samples. So for example, the third column over has VIS at the top, and that means describing visually. That was the learning outcome I was looking for, describing visually. The next one has SIG at the top. That means stating personal significance. I was looking to see if they were applying that learning outcome, stating personal significance. And what these numbers show then is how frequently transfer of each of these 10 targeted learning outcomes occurred for each of the students. For example, in the first row, we can see that student 1 submitted 6 writing samples from courses other than the EGAP course. And analysis showed that in 2 of these 6 writing samples, this student described visually. And in one of them, the student stated personal significance. And the student didn't narrate in any of them, which is the next column. And the next column, the student didn't use similes or metaphors in any of them, and so on. And again, without spending any more time on the details, we can look at the totals in the bottom row and see that all 10 of the targeted learning outcomes transferred to at least some degree, though some more than others. And I've got 2 more tables to show you of findings to see what the writing samples revealed about where this transfer occurred. This table shows where transfer occurred in the writing samples according to discipline. In the first column, there are 6 disciplines, along with the students from whom I gathered writing samples in those disciplines. And in the second column is the number of writing samples that I gathered. In column 3 is the number of transfer opportunities in those writing samples. And I'll explain briefly what I mean by transfer opportunities. If a student had demonstrated all 10 targeted learning outcomes on the writing sample that I gathered from the EGAP course, I assumed that each of the other writing samples for that student from other courses had 10 opportunities for transfer, one for each of the targeted learning outcomes. In the same way, if a student had demonstrated only 9 of the targeted learning outcomes on the writing sample I gathered from the EGAP course, I assumed that each of the other writing samples for that student from other courses had 9 opportunities for transfer, one for each of the targeted learning outcomes the student had previously demonstrated. Most of the students had demonstrated all 10 of the targeted learning outcomes on the writing sample from the EGAP course, but a few demonstrated only 9 or 8. So that's where the numbers in the third column come from. And in the final column, we can see how many instances of transfer were actually observed in the writing samples, both as a raw number and as a percentage of the opportunities for transfer. So let's take a look at the first row to clarify. In the discipline of business, 2 students, student number 1 and student number 10, had submitted writing samples for me to analyze. The total number of writing samples was 3, so obviously 2 from one student and one from the other. With those 3 writing samples, the total number of opportunities for transfer was 29. Now, if both of these students had demonstrated all 10 targeted learning outcomes on the writing sample from the EGAP course, this number would have been 30, because it would be 3 samples times 10 learning outcomes. But it's 29 because one of those students demonstrated only 9 of the 10 targeted learning outcomes on the writing sample from the EGAP course. And in the last column, we can see that across those 3 writing samples, a total of 8 instances of transfer were observed. And that represents 28% of the opportunities for transfer. So what's most important, I think, to notice here, looking down the final column, is that although there was variation, transfer did occur across all 6 disciplines. And this, this final table presents the same data, but this time organized according to task type rather than to discipline. So we can see in the first column the 7 categories of task types that I looked at. And the other 3 columns are the same kinds of information as in the previous table. And what we can see here, again, looking down the final column, is that although there was variation, transfer did occur across all 7 task types. So that's it for the specific findings as they relate to the research questions. And to summarize, the data here indicate that learning did transfer from this EGAP writing course to other academic courses. And that's important because transfer is a desirable result of any branch of TESOL, in education in general as well, particularly in contexts like EAP writing instruction where students have immediate, concrete needs. But scholars have pointed to a shortage of empirical research that examines transfer in academic writing instruction. So one general contribution of this research is that it helps add to the body of research that has directly investigated this issue in a general way. More specifically, though, these results can contribute to discussion of the actual impact of EGAP writing instruction. Scholars have questioned whether discipline general writing instruction can lead to transferable learning outcomes. And results of empirical research have been mixed, with findings in some studies suggesting that transfer does occur, and findings in other studies suggesting the opposite. The results in this study suggest that EGAP writing instruction can lead to transfer, and that such transfer can, in fact, involve a variety of learning outcomes and can occur across diverse task types and disciplines. But these results also lend support to critics of EGAP writing instruction. The results suggest that transfer in this context, while possible, is not inevitable. And this is consistent with arguments that it is unrealistic for writing instruction to aim to provide students with skills that can be applied with any particular content or in any context. If EGAP writing instruction is meant to help a student with all the writing that she or he does in an academic program, these results illustrate ways that this goal might not be met. Another notable aspect of the results was that transfer varied across learning outcomes. This was no surprise because in an earlier study that I had done myself on this topic, examining transfer from an EGAP writing course to a single out-of-class task that I designed for the research, I found variation across a range of specific learning outcomes. So the current study extends those results by examining a wider range of tasks and pointing to a similar conclusion. But in that earlier study, I had also found that learning outcomes related to language use may transfer more readily than learning outcomes related to content and organization. And in the current study, the results suggest something different, something a little more complicated. Because the learning outcome that transferred the most here was avoiding fused sentences. And that's related to language use. But so was one of the learning outcomes that transferred the least, which was using past perfect verb tense accurately. So while it's certainly possible that transfer will be more likely with some general categories of learning outcomes than with others, the results of this study suggest that this depends to at least some degree on the specific learning outcome in question and not just on the general category of learning outcome. And one final aspect of this study's findings that are worth noting is that transfer varied across disciplines and task types. Now, one of the ultimate goals of research on transfer in EGAP writing education must be to reveal not only whether transfer occurs, but also why transfer occurs. And the variation seen in this study across disciplines and task types may shed a little light here. For example, if transfer is influenced simply by discipline, the results in this study would have shown more dramatic differences across disciplines. For example, with no transfer in natural sciences and extensive transfer in humanities. Similarly, if transfer is influenced simply by task type, the results in this study would have shown no transfer with some task types, like explanations of calculations, and extensive transfer with other task types, like syntheses of multiple sources. But that's not what the results in this study show. So it looks like the conditions under which learning transfers from EGAP writing instruction are complex. And that's consistent with findings in some other studies that transfer in discipline general writing instruction may be influenced by factors like student perceptions of task similarity, student motivation, and differences between courses. For example, differences in terms of the amount of writing that students have to do and the labels that are used for writing tasks. As for practical implications, by providing a detailed picture of transfer in an EGAP writing instruction context, these results point to a question that educators might find useful. In programs and courses where transfer is an instructional goal, would patterns similar to those that emerged in this study be seen as satisfactory? For example, if transfer is common with only some targeted learning outcomes, or if transfer occurs more with the writing students do in some of their disciplines, or with some tasks in those disciplines, are instructional goals being met? If not, these goals might be revised to better fit transfer patterns. For example, by narrowing the scope so that goals focus on learning outcomes that may be more likely to transfer. Or so that goals focus on disciplines and task types that may be more likely to be associated with transfer. On the other hand, if existing goals are seen as suitable, educators might consider changes to instructional approaches. Such changes could be based on descriptions of teaching for transfer techniques in EAP education. For example, techniques like promoting transfer by having students read and write texts in a variety of familiar and unfamiliar genres, or by having students compare and contrast texts across and within genres, or by having students reflect on strategies they use to complete their writing tasks. These suggestions reflect discussions of teaching for transfer in general education, not just in EAP education. And that might be a useful resource for EAP educators as well. For example, there is a teaching for transfer framework in general education that focuses on two main types of techniques, hugging and bridging. Hugging means designing instruction to have obvious similarities to target contexts. For example, by using simulations and problem-solving tasks that mimic aspects of target contexts. And bridging, on the other hand, means designing instruction such that students' learning is pushed to abstract levels. For example, by having students reflect on their performance in tasks and compare and contrast multiple problem-solving tasks. Additional suggestions include ensuring students have extensive practice using targeted learning outcomes over time and across tasks. And also timing instruction to coincide with students' needs to use targeted learning outcomes. These and other similar teaching techniques could be used in EGAP writing instruction to try to promote more consistent transfer. And to wrap up, this study has limitations that can be addressed in future research. First, the definition of transfer I used here was effective. It worked in this study, but it would be worth looking for ways to refine it. On the positive side, transfer was viewed here through both participants' reports of transfer and evidence in writing samples. And this was preferable to viewing transfer from only one of these angles, which has been a limitation of some of the previous research. On the other hand, transfer was seen here as involving not only learning that originated in the EAP writing course, but also learning that may have originated elsewhere. In other words, before the participant entered the EAP course. It's difficult to pinpoint that, and through the interviews, for example, I was asking students, about learning that had occurred in the course, things that they had learned and or practiced in the course. It's difficult to be precise about where that learning sort of originates. This broad perspective that I took reflects the notion that EAP writing ability is complex and develops over time, but it's also problematic because the resulting picture of transfer is unclear. So to generate sharper images of the impact that EAP writing courses have on transfer, future research might examine more directly the learning that occurs in that instructional setting. And this might be done, for example, by examining the feedback that EAP writing instructors give to individual students and the corresponding revisions that students make to their writing in the EAP course, and then examining the students' writing in other courses for evidence of that transfer. Another point is that the focus in this study was on investigating whether transfer occurred, and it did not extend to other potentially important related issues. For example, while evidence of transfer was found here, the quality of that transfer was not judged here. And that raises questions because transfer can be judged in terms of whether its impact is positive or negative, or neither. Now, the question of what makes transfer positive or negative can be complicated. For example, because we have to decide from whose perspective to judge it. But future research might be designed to try to work this out and explore the quality of transfer in EGAP writing instruction. Furthermore, the reasons why transfer did or did not occur were not examined directly in this study. Elsewhere, transfer has been linked to a range of factors related to learners, learning tasks, learning contexts, transfer tasks, and transfer contexts. Therefore, future research that investigates factors that promote or inhibit transfer in EGAP writing instruction would be worthwhile. And finally, although this study is directly relevant to discussions about discipline specificity in EAP writing instruction, whether we should take a general focus or a more specific focus, it's inappropriate to draw any conclusions based on these findings about the relative efficacy of a general approach versus a specific approach. Transfer did occur in the example of EGAP writing instruction that I looked at here, a general purposes approach. As a result, EGAP writing instruction can be seen from a learning transfer perspective as potentially effective. But I didn't look at specific purposes EAP writing instruction. So whether the specific purposes approach, or ESAP, can be more, less, or equally effective is unknown based on these results, obviously. So therefore, empirical research that sheds light on transfer in ESAP writing instruction settings would be an effective way to build on these findings. So that's all I wanted to go over with you today, and I think we have about 10 minutes for questions. Thank you. Please.
I appreciate how you were able to highlight the tension that many of us face, the reality that we do teach in general contexts, and that it has both, it does result both in the transfer, yay, but not maybe to the extent across the disciplines that we would hope for.
Yeah.
But my question is about specifically how you determined the opportunities for transfer.
Sure.
And I understood the mathematics behind it, how you took the maximum number and multiplied by the number of samples.
Yeah.
But the question I had is, the samples that the students provided to you varied greatly.
Yes.
Because you took, from how they might have, any sort of writing product.
Yes.
So I'm curious about how you justified that the maximum opportunities legitimately could exist in all of the samples when the samples themselves were so diverse.
Are very different. Yeah, that's a good question. And I struggled with that specific question as I was trying to work out a way to quantify this. I felt a need when I was doing this study, when I was analyzing the data, to complement the qualitative descriptions of what was happening and the examples of transfer with some quantification. That's why with the interview transcripts, I described the categories that the students reported, but I also report them in terms of frequency, which ones are most common, which ones are least common. With the writing samples, yeah, this was one of the questions I struggled with. How can I provide some quantification of this? And this seemed to be the best of the options that I could think of. It doesn't mean it's the only way, but I think to illustrate the potential difficulty with the way that I did that, if we were talking about a writing sample, with an essay that a student writes in a sociology course or a history course, the 10 targeted learning outcomes that they had gone over in the EAP course, it would be fairly easy to see how these things could be applied, because it was things like stating personal significance. Is the student able to explain why the piece of writing that they're doing is relevant to them, stating personal significance. There were things like, coherence, using transition words, things like that. So we can easily look at a writing sample or a writing task, like an essay for a sociology course, and say, yeah, I can see these things being applied. If we're talking about a single sentence explanation on a math test, right? Then it doesn't make sense that they would apply this. So the way that I'm justifying this for myself is that it still provides us with a picture of what's happening. It would be very strange for a student to apply some of these learning outcomes in some of these types of writing, like a single sentence explanation on a math test. That doesn't mean that they don't do them, though, and there still are some of those learning outcomes are being applied across these task types.
It's a question of quantity. Like in an ideal world, you could separate the samples, and you could analyze. Here's what's happening with math tests.
With these tasks, yeah.
So,
yeah, absolutely.
With the case study, of course, you're limited in your numbers. But.
Yeah. I think one of the main reasons that I felt okay doing it this way after the fact is that it provides us with a broad way, the broadest way that I could think of looking for transfer. These are the 10 things that they have focused on in their EAP writing course. Let's look for all 10 in all of the writing they do elsewhere and just see what happens. So they're probably not going to apply a lot of these things when they write a single sentence explanation of a math calculation. But I'm going to look for them anyway, because you never know. And so there were some surprises when I was analyzing the data. I was able to find things. I didn't expect to see anything in those kinds of math calculation explanations. But some of the students were telling me, yeah, I used transition words that I'd learned in my EAP course. And sure enough, I could see them there. And had I taken a narrower view where I sort of blocked some things out from the beginning, I wouldn't have looked for all 10 learning outcomes in all of these writing samples. I probably wouldn't have looked at all the types of writing samples. I would have said, you know what, I'm not even going to bother looking at math tests. Why bother? And then I would have missed some of these examples of transfer. So it's taking a broad view. Yeah. Please.
Yes, sir. Of the 11 students that submitted samples, were any of them limited English proficient? And if so, was that a factor taken into analyzing your data?
They were all non-native speakers of English.
But were they limited English proficient?
Is there a variation?
In terms of their proficiency, I didn't measure that. These are all students currently enrolled at a research institute, a research university in the U.S. So they've met the minimum English proficiency requirements to get into that university, which are, I believe, around 85 on the IBT. So anyway, yeah, that's the closest that I have to a measure of their proficiency. A floor. I don't have a ceiling. Well, they're not going to be higher than 120. So yeah, there we go. That's the range. Yeah. and they're all from the same section of the course. And at that institution, students are divided into levels depending on their scores on TOEFL or other measures of English proficiency. So these guys were in the middle. This was the lowest level of the 3 levels of the course. So they'd be at the lower end of that 85 and above range.
So they were able to still produce writing samples that, I guess, met whatever criteria?
Yeah, that's a good question, right. I didn't ask about their actual grades in their other courses. I wouldn't be surprised if some of them were having some, I mean, if you look at a range of students in these courses, you're typically going to see that their performance in other courses varies. Some are doing very well, some are not doing so well. I didn't take that data into account, but I would expect there's a range. So they are producing, for the most part, writing that meets the requirements of their other courses. Yeah. Please.
Well, that leads into a question of how much difficulty you had in coding when there were errors, presence of errors. I mean, there's
Yeah.
sometimes did you run into that as a...
That's interesting. Yeah, I tried to stay as focused as possible on the 10 learning outcomes that the textbook had focused, their EAP textbook had identified and was, emphasizing in the first chapter of the book. So I had to ignore other things so that I could remain focused. But sure, there were plenty of other things, mistakes, errors that I could have looked at. Yeah, I mean, I tried to give careful instructions to the other person coding. So yeah, so that seemed to be okay. Yeah, please.
My thing is the noticing skills of discipline experts. So I was interested, he said transfer and grade high up.
Yeah.
So if they really transfer, like, was it reflected in the grades?
Right.
If they didn't transfer, they still achieve high grades.
Great question, yeah. Yeah, and you know what? It's connected to one of the points I made at the end about looking at not just whether transfer occurs, but looking at the quality of transfer. And in other research on learning transfer, the distinctions made between positive and negative transfer. Because, transfer can still happen, but it might have a negative impact on what, it might be overgeneralizing things. So I didn't look at it here. I think it's an important question, and this is one way to look at it, is to see how this kind of data, this kind of information, correlates with grades in other courses. Absolutely, yeah. Please, yeah.
Did you? I missed the very beginning. So did you tell us what textbook you used?
Which textbook were they using? I may be remembering this incorrectly, because I didn't say anything about it here, but I believe it was the St. Martin's Guide.
Okay, because again, it could be, you're demonstrating transfer can happen, but it also depends on the quality of the instructional material.
Yes,
Not all
yes.
the instructional material in another study would be equally good or not so good.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, this is one direction that I want to go with this line of research, because I've done a few studies on this topic, and they've been similar, looking to see whether transfer is happening in a particular context. But one of the things I want to do more with future research is to look at what we as EAP instructors, ESL instructors, from our end of this transfer situation, from our end of it, from the teaching end of it, what can we do? What can we do in terms of the materials that we use and create? What can we do in terms of the teaching techniques we use to try to promote this more? Because you're absolutely right. I would expect variation if I had looked at two different sections of this course. Yeah, absolutely. Please.
Looking at the results from what the students reported most frequently that they transferred, and then your findings when you actually analyzed what was the most frequently used items, it looked like there was a big difference between what the students were reporting and what they were actually using.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that?
Yeah, there were some differences. Yeah. And I don't recall what the main differences were, but there was some overlap and there were some differences. And so the reason that I wanted to look at students' perspectives, and writing samples was because in some of the other studies, these dual perspectives haven't been presented. It's been mainly it's mainly been just reports. And it fits with the idea that, as individuals, when transfer happens, it's something that we could be aware of, but it might be something we have no awareness of. There could be intentional transfer, things that we think about explicitly and say, I want to try to use that. I want to try to do this. But then all the time, things are happening that we're not aware of. That's where I would see the explanation of that discrepancy. And it would be this is the first time that I've done it that way, in this particular context. It would be worth developing that more to take a look at those try to bring those patterns out more to see what the differences are between what students are aware of transferring and what they're not aware of transferring. Absolutely, yeah, that would be interesting. Please.
Just a quick question. I
Sure.
thought it was interesting that you referenced Horowitz's 1986 kind of genre of
Yeah.
education. I haven't thought about that since grad school.
Right.
The question would be, was that sufficient for you? Do you think that that's something that needs to be revisited in terms of collecting greater amounts of that type of data, of actual writing prompts? I don't know.
Yeah.
You mentioned collecting the samples, and I
Yes.
wasn't sure if that was paired with prompt so that you had very clear, whether
Right.
or not the student
What they were responding to, yeah. I tried wherever possible to gather that data, to gather whatever information the students gave to me. But I didn't analyze. So I wasn't always given the prompts that they were responding to. Students would show up and give me bits and pieces of paper. Yeah, exactly. Take what I can get. But
was his classification?
it worked. I made a couple of small changes to it. For example, the explanations of calculations wasn't in that framework. And that's one I've referred to a couple times. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that wasn't there. And so the data that I was looking at included, I asked students for any kind of writing, and they were bringing in math tests. And I thought, okay, yeah, they've written a little paragraph here to explain their results. Why don't I take a look at that as well? Horowitz's framework doesn't include it. Okay, I'm going to add that. So I made a couple of modifications, but for the most part, it worked fine. Yeah, and again, with those reliability figures, the other rater had no problem.
It's always a related question. I'm just asking, do you think genres have changed in 30 years? That's really what I'm asking.
Yeah. That's a good question. Yeah, digitally would be one way, wouldn't it? But yeah. I'll look at that next time. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.